A wounded man is rescued on the street by a brave boy. But when he tries to find him, he discovers that he is his own son, whom he abandoned years ago. Now he will do anything to regain his trust. But will it be too late? Arthur Mendes walked with uncertain steps along the dark, deserted street. The night was thick, and the cold air pierced his bones. His mind was wandering between tiredness and impatience when he felt a sharp blow to his back. He barely had time to turn around before other impacts made him fall to his knees. Rough hands held him down as they searched his pockets. The echo of his own labored breathing mixed with the harsh voices of his attackers. He tried to resist, but a sharp blow to his temple stunned him. His body fell heavily to the asphalt, pain pulsing through every fiber of his being. The sound of hurried footsteps and laughter faded into the distance. Arthur was left there, among shadows and rubble, with the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. He didn't know how much time passed before he felt a presence nearby. Light footsteps approached cautiously. Then, a slender but firm hand touched his shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" The voice was young, but full of a maturity unbecoming of a child. Arthur blinked and managed to focus on the boy who was looking at him with concern. His hair was disheveled, his clothes worn, and his eyes filled with a mixture of distrust and determination. "Who are you?" Arthur stammered. "Don't worry about it now. We have to get him out of here." Before he could respond, the boy put an arm under his back and helped him sit up. Arthur groaned in pain, feeling every wound protest, but the boy didn't let go. "I'm going to call someone," he said, taking an old cell phone out of his pocket. Arthur, still dazed, tried to move. His body was numb and his vision remained blurry. "Why are you helping me?" he asked in a raspy voice. The boy hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because if I were you, I would like someone to do the same." Arthur felt a strange knot in his chest. He couldn't remember the last time someone had offered him selfless help. Minutes later, the sirens of an ambulance broke the silence of the night. Arthur felt his consciousness slowly fading away. Before losing consciousness completely, he managed to utter a few last words. "I'm going to find you, and thank you." But when he woke up in the hospital, the boy had already disappeared without a trace. Arthur woke up with the white light of the hospital hurting his eyes. A dull pain throbbed in his head, and his body still felt the blows of the night before. He tried to move, but felt the stiffness of his muscles protesting. A doctor entered the room, checking on her condition. "Mr. Mendes, you were lucky. Just a few bruises and a slight concussion. With rest, you will recover soon." Arthur barely nodded. His mind was elsewhere. The child. "Who brought me here?" The doctor frowned, consulting some papers. "A young man called the ambulance but did not leave his name." Arthur sat up a little in bed. "I need to find him." After insisting with the hospital staff, she got a vague description. A boy of about 10 years old, thin, with worn clothes. No last name, no address. Just a ghost in the city. Arthur would not give up. Using his contacts, he managed to gain access to the emergency report. There was a phone number registered. The key was there. He dialed the number without hesitation. "Hello?" The female voice on the other end of the line left him breathless. Arthur would recognize that voice anywhere. "Clara. I'm Arthur. I need to know who the boy was who helped me last night." There was a tense silence. Then Clara's voice hardened. "And why do you care?" "Because I want to thank you." "Who is it?" Clara laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of joy. "You can't be serious." Arthur frowned. "What are you talking about?" Clara took a deep breath before answering, her voice thick with resentment. "The boy who saved you is your son, Arthur. His name is João." The impact of those words hit him harder than any punch from the night before. "Your son?" The air seemed to be drained from his lungs. His mind traveled back in time, to the moment when he had chosen his career over Clara. He had assumed that everything had been buried with time, but it wasn't like that. "Clara, I didn't know." "You didn't know because you never cared to know," she interrupted, her voice full of pain. Arthur felt a pressure in his chest, a whirlwind of mixed emotions. "Let me see him. I want to talk to him." Clara let out a bitter laugh. Not after all these years. Not after what you did. The phone went silent. Clara had hung up. Arthur dropped the phone onto the bed, his mind dazed and his heart pounding. João? His son. And now the boy who had saved him wanted nothing to do with him. Arthur wasted no time. As soon as he was discharged, he began looking for Clara and João. It wasn't hard to find them. Clara had never left the city, but when he arrived at their modest apartment, he was not greeted with kindness. Clara crossed her arms when she saw him at the door. You have no right to be here. Arthur swallowed. 10 years. So much time had passed, and yet the wound was still open. I just want to talk. Clara shook her head. Late. João doesn't need a father who only appears when it suits him. Arthur felt guilt digging into his chest. I didn't know about him, Clara. If I had known... If you had known what? She interrupted him. Would you have left your perfect life to raise a child? Don't make me laugh. Arthur clenched his fists. I couldn't blame her. He had chosen his career. He had left Clara alone when she needed him most. But now, seeing what he had lost, he could not stand by and do nothing. Let me help, at least financially. Clara snorted, her expression full of contempt. Money? Do you think you can pay for your guilt with money? João doesn't need that. He needs a father, but not one like you. Arthur felt those words like a blow. At that moment, João appeared behind Clara. Their eyes met, and Arthur felt his heart race. It was like looking into a mirror of the past. The boy looked at him suspiciously. Are you him? Arthur swallowed. Yeah. João studied him, frowning. You don't look like much. Arthur gave a dry laugh, but João didn't smile. Clara placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Come on, João. The boy hesitated before following her, but before disappearing into the house, he looked at Arthur once more. We don't need you. The door closed, and Arthur felt his world crumble. He stood there for a few minutes, fists clenched, breathing deeply. He wouldn't give up. If João didn't want him in his life, then I would have to show him that I was worth staying with. Arthur spent days thinking about what had happened. João's indifference, Clara's resentment. He couldn't blame them. He had been absent for 10 years. But there was one thing that was clear to me, was not going to disappear again. If João didn't want his help directly, then he would find another way to approach him. She investigated and discovered that the boy was spending time at a shelter for homeless children. He did not live there permanently, but he went there frequently. So Arthur showed up. The shelter was an old but welcoming building. Children ran around the yard, some in worn clothes, others with faces hardened by life. Arthur felt a lump in his throat. It was a world I had never been a part of. He approached one of the volunteers. I would like to help. The woman looked at him curiously. Have you worked with at-risk children before? Arthur shook his head. But I want to learn. And so, it began. He started with simple tasks, handing out food, cleaning tables, organizing activities. At first, the children looked at him with suspicion, but little by little, they began to accept him. Except João. The boy watched him from a distance, his arms crossed and his brow furrowed. You don't have to pretend to care, he told him one day when Arthur tried to talk to him. Arthur took a deep breath. I'm not pretending. João studied him with a sharp gaze. How long are you going to stay? A month? 2? Arthur knelt down to be at her level. I'm not going to leave. João clenched his jaw. We'll see. With that, he walked away. But Arthur noticed something different. He was no longer unaware of it. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. Arthur smiled. Maybe there was still hope. Arthur felt like he was making progress, albeit slowly. João was no longer completely ignoring him. He watched his actions, analyzing him, waiting to see the moment when he would give in. But Arthur was determined to prove to him that this time would not leave. One day as he left the shelter, he found Clara waiting for him at the door. Her expression was serious, her posture tense. Can we talk? She asked, crossing her arms. Arthur nodded, and they walked to a nearby cafe. As soon as they sat down, Clara was direct. Why are you doing this? Arthur looked at her sincerely. Because I want my son back. Clara let out a bitter laugh. And what makes you think you can? Arthur sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know I can't erase the past, but I want to try to do things right now. Clara narrowed her eyes. Do you really think that a few visits to the shelter and a few kind gestures can make up for everything? Arthur looked down. Nothing I did would change the past. Clara continued, her voice heavy with resentment. Do you know what it was like to raise João alone? Working double shifts, watching him ask for his father when he was little, and I had no answer? Do you know what it felt like to see him sleeping on the street when we had nowhere to go? Arthur felt a punch in the stomach. Clara, I didn't know. Of course you didn't know, she exclaimed, her eyes full of rage. Because you never asked. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment. He had been a coward. He had chosen his career, his comfort, without looking back. When he opened them again, he spoke firmly. You're right, I failed, and nothing I say will change what you did for João. But I want to be a part of his life now. Clara looked at him in silence for a long moment. João is a strong boy. He doesn't need his heart broken again. Arthur leaned forward. I'm not going to break your heart. I'm going to earn it. Clara let out a tired sigh and looked away. I don't know if it's too late, Arthur. He clenched his fists under the table. Let me prove that it is not. Clara didn't respond immediately. Finally, she stood up and looked at him one last time before leaving. I hope for João's sake that you are not mistaken. Arthur watched her disappear down the street. His chest was heavy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt that maybe there was an opportunity. Now it was just up to him not to waste it. Arthur knew that the road to João would not be easy. Gaining their trust would require time, patience, and perseverance. So when the shelter organized an outing for the children to an amusement park, Arthur jumped at the chance. He volunteered to accompany them, and to his surprise, João didn't object. The boy remained distant, but accepted her presence. It was progress. At the park, Arthur watched as João ran with other children, laughing, forgetting for a moment the hardships of his life. After a while, Arthur came over with 2 ice creams in his hand and offered him one. João looked at him suspiciously before taking it. Thank you, she murmured without looking directly at him. They sat on a bench. The silence between them was not awkward, but it was heavy with unsaid things. João broke the stillness with a direct question. Why did you leave? Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He didn't expect João to confront him so soon. He sighed and looked the boy in the eyes. Because I was an idiot, João frowned. I already know that. Arthur smiled sadly. I was scared. I thought my career was the most important thing and that I wasn't ready to be a father. But I was wrong. João looked down, playing with the wrapper of his ice cream. And why are you ready now? Arthur took a deep breath. Because when I woke up in the hospital and learned that the boy who saved me was you, I understood what I had lost. João didn't answer immediately. He just nodded slightly. The bond between them remained fragile, but for the first time, Arthur felt that João was willing to give him a chance. And that was all I needed. The following days brought a subtle change in the relationship between Arthur and João. Although the boy remained cautious, he no longer avoided his presence. It was a breakthrough. However, Clara still didn't trust him. One afternoon, Arthur came to his house with the intention of talking about João. He wanted to discuss how they could work together to give him a better future. But the conversation quickly became tense. You can't just show up after 10 years and expect everything to be resolved, Clara snapped, crossing her arms. Arthur ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. I know I'm not, but I'm trying. What else do you want me to do? I want you to understand that João is not a whim. You cannot enter his life if there is a possibility that you will leave again. Arthur felt the impact of those words. I'm not going to leave. Clara let out a bitter laugh. That's easy to say. Arthur was about to answer, but a noise at the door interrupted him. João was there. His face hardened. Don't fight over me, he said quietly. Clara softened her expression. Honey, we're not fighting. Yes, they are, João cut in, his fists clenched. And I'm fed up. With that, he turned on his heel and ran away. "Joan!" Clara called, but the boy did not stop. Arthur didn't hesitate to go after him. He looked for him in the streets, asked the neighbors, went to the places where he knew Joan used to go, but he was nowhere to be found. Desperation took hold of him. I had failed again, and this time, Joan could be in danger. Arthur felt his heart pounding in his chest as he walked through the streets in search of Joan. Fear consumed him. He blamed himself. He had tried to do things right, but one argument had been enough to drive the boy away. What if something happened to him? Finally, in a dark alley, he saw a small silhouette huddled against a wall. John. Arthur ran towards him. "John!" The boy raised his head, and Arthur saw his tired but also defiant face. "You didn't need to look for me. I can take care of myself." Arthur knelt beside her, breathing heavily. "I know that, but it doesn't mean I want you to be alone." Joan looked down. "I'm always alone." Arthur felt something break inside him. "No more," he said firmly. "You don't have to be alone anymore." Joan looked at him skeptically, but there was something else in his eyes, a spark of vulnerability. "Why do you care so much?" he asked quietly. Arthur moved closer. "Because I'm your father, and even though I'm late, I'm not leaving again." The silence between them stretched out. Joan seemed to be struggling internally, as if he wanted to believe her words but was afraid to do so. Finally, Joan sighed and nodded slightly. All right, it wasn't a complete forgiveness. It wasn't a complete acceptance, but it was a start. Arthur extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Joan took it. Together, they walked out of the darkness of the alley and returned home. After that night, something changed between Arthur and Joan. The wall of mistrust had not completely disappeared, but there were cracks in it. Joan continued to test Arthur. He watched every gesture, every promise, waiting to see if he would ever fail. But Arthur was not going to give up. Clara had noticed the difference too. Although she still had reservations, she accepted Arthur's presence more. By Joan. "Don't make me regret this," she warned him one afternoon. Arthur nodded seriously. "I won't do it." They began to make agreements. Joan spent more time with Arthur, although always under Clara's supervision. They were small steps, but firm steps. Arthur discovered things about his son that he would never have imagined. Their intelligence, their wit, their resilience. And Joan, little by little, began to trust him. One night, while Arthur was accompanying him to the shelter, Joan spoke in a low voice. "Sometimes I think you're going to leave." Arthur stopped and looked at the boy. "And what would make you think otherwise?" Joan shrugged. "I don't know. Only time will tell." Arthur smiled sadly. "Then I will wait as long as necessary." Joan looked at him for a moment before nodding slightly. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to build something real. Months have passed since that night when Joan gave Arthur his first sign of trust. It was not an easy process, but each day brought a small victory, a longer conversation, a shared laugh, a less distrustful look. But Arthur knew there was still more to do. So one sunny morning, he gathered Joan and Clara in front of a renovated building in the city center. What is this?" Joan asked, crossing his arms. Arthur smiled. "A shelter for street children, so that no one else has to feel alone like you felt." Joan looked at him in amazement. "And you did it for me?" Arthur nodded. "You taught me what really matters." Clara at his side watched him with a mixture of surprise and excitement. Joan looked away, as if trying to hide what he felt. Then he murmured in a low voice, "It's great." Arthur felt a lump in his throat. They may not have been the most effusive words, but they meant everything to him. Clara squeezed his arm gently. "You did a good thing, Arthur." He smiled, looking at Joan. "I did it for our family." Joan didn't answer right away, but then with a small smile he approached Arthur. "Dad!" Arthur felt the world stop. It was the first time Joan called him that. Without hesitation, she hugged him. It didn't matter how much time was lost. Now they had a new beginning. Life always gives us a second chance, but it's up to us to take advantage of it. Arthur had built something tangible, something real. The shelter wasn't just a building, it was a testament to his redemption, a way to prove, not just to Joan and Clara, but to himself, that he had changed. The long nights of planning, the negotiations, the endless paperwork, none of it mattered as much as the look on Joan's face when he first saw the place. The boy still had his guard up, but Arthur had come to accept that trust wasn't something given overnight. It had to be earned brick by brick, just like the shelter. Arthur became deeply involved in the shelter's daily operations. He spent hours talking to the children, learning their stories, their fears, their dreams. Some, like Joan, had been abandoned. Others had fled from broken homes, seeking refuge from violence or neglect. He listened, he helped where he could, but most importantly, he showed up every single day. One evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, Arthur found Joan sitting on the steps of the shelter, staring at the street beyond. "Thinking about something?" Arthur asked, sitting beside him. Joan hesitated before shrugging. "Just wondering how different things would be if you had stayed." Arthur swallowed. The past was a weight he had learned to carry, but Joan's words always had a way of making it feel heavier. "I wonder about that too," Arthur admitted. "I regret a lot of things, Joan, but I don't regret coming back." The boy studied him for a long moment, then let out a small breath. "You're really not leaving, are you?" Arthur shook his head. "Not ever." Joan didn't respond right away, but then, in the smallest of gestures, he nudged Arthur's arm with his own. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Days turned into weeks, and Arthur saw the change happening, not just in Joan, but in himself. He had gone from an outsider looking in to someone Joan could rely on. If not as a father yet, then at least as someone who wasn't going to walk away again. But not everyone was as ready to forgive. Clara was still cautious, watching his every move, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She didn't argue as much anymore, but she also didn't let herself believe too easily. One evening, as Arthur was helping organize donated supplies, she approached him. "I don't know if I'll ever fully trust you again," she said, crossing her arms, "but I can see you're trying, and that means something." Arthur looked at her, understanding in his gaze. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Clara. I just want to be a better father to Joan. And if I can make up for what I did to you, even a little, I'll do it." She studied him, her expression softening just a little. "You've changed." Arthur smiled faintly. "I had to." It wasn't an instant reconciliation. It wasn't a storybook ending, but it was real. One night, as Arthur locked up the shelter, he felt a tug on his sleeve. He turned to see Joan standing there, a hesitant look in his eyes. "Can I show you something?" Joan asked. Arthur nodded, following the boy as he led him through the quiet city streets. After a few blocks, Joan stopped in front of an old rundown park. The swings were rusted, the benches worn, but there was something nostalgic about the place. "This is where my mom used to bring me when I was little," Joan said, kicking at the dirt. "When we had nowhere else to go, we came here." Arthur's heart clenched. He could picture it too vividly. Clara, exhausted but determined, watching over their son as he played, despite having nothing. "I should have been here," Arthur murmured. Joan didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed at one of the swings. "She used to push me on that one." Arthur glanced at the swing, then at Joan. "Want me to push you now?" The boy snorted. "I'm not a kid anymore." Arthur chuckled. "Fair enough." They stood in silence for a moment before Joan turned to face him. "I don't know if I can call you Dad yet," he admitted, "but maybe one day." Arthur felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. He nodded, not pushing, not rushing. "That's enough for me." And for the first time in his life, Arthur truly believed that it was. As the days passed, Arthur found himself slipping into a life he had once thought impossible. One where Joan wasn't just a name in his past, but a presence in his future. It was in the small moments that he saw the change. Joan no longer flinched when Arthur ruffled his hair absent-mindedly. He no longer ignored Arthur's attempts at conversation. Instead, he started asking questions, small ones at first, about Arthur's job, his favorite food, the places he had been. One evening, Arthur found Joan sketching in an old notebook at the shelter. "You draw?" Arthur asked, peering over his shoulder. Joan instinctively pulled the notebook away. "It's just something I do when I'm bored." Arthur smiled. Can I see? Jerome hesitated before flipping to a page and handing it over. Arthur examined the sketch carefully, a cityscape, drawn with incredible detail. The lines were precise, the shading impressive. "This is amazing," Arthur said, genuine admiration in his voice. "You're really talented." Jerome shrugged. "It's just a hobby." Arthur handed the notebook back. "Maybe it could be more than that." Jerome studied him for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Then he nodded, just slightly, before tucking the notebook under his arm. The interaction was brief, but Arthur felt something shift. Jerome was starting to let him in, but there were still barriers between them. One night, Arthur found Jerome sitting alone outside the shelter, staring at the city lights. "You okay?" Arthur asked, sitting beside him. Jerome took a deep breath. "Why did you really come back?" Arthur turned to face him. "Because I realized what I lost." Jerome frowned. "But why now? Why not years ago?" Arthur sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I was a coward, Jerome. I told myself that staying away was the best thing for everyone, that I had nothing to offer you. But when I woke up in that hospital and found out that you, my own son, had saved me, I knew I had to make things right." Jerome's expression was unreadable. "And what if I never forgive you?" Arthur nodded, accepting the possibility. "Then I'll still be here, because this isn't about what I want. It's about what you need. And if all you need is to know that I won't leave again, then that's enough for me." Jerome stared at him for a long time before looking away. "We'll see." Arthur didn't push. He had learned by now that trust wasn't something Jerome could just hand over. It had to be earned day by day. But Arthur was willing to wait, and somehow he felt that Jerome was beginning to believe him. Arthur didn't expect things to change overnight. He knew that trust was a slow build, a careful balance between patience and persistence. But every small step Jerome took toward him felt like a victory. One evening, Arthur arrived at the shelter to find Jerome sitting in a corner, deep in concentration. The boy was hunched over his notebook, sketching furiously. Curious, Arthur sat down beside him. "What are you working on?" Jerome hesitated before tilting the page toward him. It was a drawing of the shelter, but not as it was now. The worn-out walls were restored, the windows gleamed, and there was a garden out front where children played. Arthur studied the drawing carefully. "This is incredible. You see things the way they could be, not just the way they are." Jerome shrugged. "Just an idea." Arthur smiled. "A great one." Jerome hesitated, then spoke quietly. "You really think so?" Arthur nodded. "Absolutely. You have talent, Jerome. If this is something you love, I want to help you develop it." Jerome's eyes flickered with something, cautious hope. But just as quickly, his guard went up again. "You don't have to say that just because you're trying to make up for stuff." Arthur met his gaze. "I'm saying it because it's true, and because I care about you." Jerome didn't respond right away. Instead, he closed his notebook and stood up. "It's late. I should go." Arthur watched him leave, recognizing the pattern now. Whenever things got too real, too close, Jerome pulled away. But Arthur wasn't discouraged. The fact that Jerome had even shared his drawing with him was a step forward, and Arthur had learned that sometimes the quiet moments spoke the loudest. A few days later, Jerome surprised him. Arthur had just finished helping the shelter staff when Jerome approached, hands stuffed in his pockets. He kicked at the dirt before speaking. "There's an art contest at school," Jerome muttered. "The theme is a better tomorrow." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "That sounds perfect for you." Jerome shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. I was thinking about entering, but it's stupid." Arthur shook his head. "It's not stupid, it's brave, and I think you should do it." Jerome looked at him, searching his face for any sign of dishonesty. Finally, he exhaled. "Okay, but if I enter, I don't want a big deal about it." Arthur smirked. "No big deal." "Got it." Jerome started to walk away, but then stopped. "And if I win, you can come see it." Arthur felt a warmth spread in his chest. He didn't know if Jerome realized how much those words meant. "I'd love that," Arthur said simply. Jerome gave a small nod before disappearing into the shelter. Arthur stood there for a long time, feeling something shift deep inside him. He had once thought that redemption was about proving himself, But now he realized it was about showing Joan that he was here to stay. And for the first time, Arthur believed that maybe, just maybe, Joan was starting to believe it too. Arthur found himself adjusting to a routine he never thought he'd have, one where Joan was a constant presence in his life. Though their relationship was still fragile, there were moments, small and fleeting, that told Arthur he was making progress. One afternoon, Arthur arrived at the shelter to find Joan in the courtyard, leaning against the wall, lost in thought. "What's on your mind?" Arthur asked, stepping closer. Joan didn't answer right away. Instead, he kicked a loose pebble on the ground before finally speaking. "The art contest is next week." Arthur nodded, keeping his voice even. "Are you ready?" Joan shrugged. "I guess, it's just, I don't really know if I'm good enough." Arthur frowned. "Joan, I've seen your work. You're more than good enough." Joan still looked unconvinced. "I don't want to get my hopes up." Arthur sighed, crouching so he was at eye level with him. "Let me tell you something I wish someone had told me a long time ago. If you never believe in yourself, you'll never know what you're capable of. You don't have to win. You just have to try." Joan looked away, processing his words. Then after a long pause, he mumbled, "I don't have anything to wear to the event." Arthur saw through the statement immediately. This wasn't about clothes. It was about feeling like he didn't belong. "Then let's go find something," Arthur said casually. "Nothing fancy, just something that makes you feel comfortable." Joan hesitated. He had spent so long being independent, rejecting help, that the idea of accepting something, even something small, felt foreign. But for once, he didn't push Arthur away. "Okay," Joan said, barely above a whisper. Arthur kept his reaction neutral, but inside he knew this was another step forward. The next day, Arthur took Joan shopping. It was a simple outing, but for Arthur, it felt monumental. Joan had always been guarded, reluctant to let Arthur in, but today things were different. They walked through a small clothing store, Joan scanning the racks with practiced detachment, as if trying not to show too much interest. "You don't have to pick anything fancy," Arthur said. "Just something you feel good in." Joan eventually picked a simple button-up shirt and a pair of dark jeans. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would draw attention. But when he stepped out of the fitting room, Arthur could see the difference in his posture. He stood a little straighter, more confident, like for the first time, he could actually see himself as someone who belonged at that contest. Arthur smiled. "You look great." Joan rolled his eyes. "It's just clothes." Arthur chuckled. "Maybe, but sometimes the right clothes can make you feel like you're ready for anything." Joan didn't argue. When they left the store, Joan surprised him again. "Thanks," he muttered. Arthur glanced at him. "For what?" Joan stuffed his hands in his pockets. "For this, for not making it weird." Arthur swallowed the lump in his throat. "Anytime, Joan." And for the first time, Arthur could see it. Joan was starting to trust him. Not completely, not fully, but it was a start. And that was all Arthur needed. Arthur had built something tangible, something real. The shelter wasn't just a building, it was a testament to his redemption, a way to prove, not just to Joan and Clara, but to himself, that he had changed. The long nights of planning, the negotiations, the endless paperwork, none of it mattered as much as the look on Joan's face when he first saw the place. The boy still had his guard up, but Arthur had come to accept that trust wasn't something given overnight. It had to be earned, brick by brick, just like the shelter. Arthur became deeply involved in the shelter's daily operations. He spent hours talking to the children, learning their stories, their fears, their dreams. Some, like Joan, had been abandoned. Others had fled from broken homes, seeking refuge from violence or neglect. He listened, he helped where he could, but most importantly, he showed up every single day. One evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, Arthur found Joan sitting on the steps of the shelter, staring at the street beyond. "Thinking about something?" Arthur asked, sitting beside him. Joan hesitated before shrugging. "Just wondering how different things would be if you had stayed." Arthur swallowed. The past was a weight he had learned to carry, but Joan's words always had a way of making it feel heavier. "I wonder about that too," Arthur admitted. "I regret a lot of things, Joan, but I don't regret coming back." The boy studied him for a long moment, then let out a small breath. "You're really not leaving, are you?" Arthur shook his head. "Not ever." Joanne didn't respond right away, but then, in the smallest of gestures, he nudged Arthur's arm with his own. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Days turned into weeks, and Arthur saw the change happening, not just in Joanne, but in himself. He had gone from an outsider looking in to someone Joanne could rely on. If not as a father yet, then at least as someone who wasn't going to walk away again. But not everyone was as ready to forgive. Clara was still cautious, watching his every move, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She didn't argue as much anymore, but she also didn't let herself believe too easily. One evening, as Arthur was helping organize donated supplies, she approached him. "I don't know if I'll ever fully trust you again," she said, crossing her arms, "but I can see you're trying, and that means something." Arthur looked at her, understanding in his gaze. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Clara. I just want to be a better father to Joanne. And if I can make up for what I did to you, even a little, I'll do it." She studied him, her expression softening just a little. "You've changed." Arthur smiled faintly. "I had to." It wasn't an instant reconciliation. It wasn't a storybook ending, but it was real. One night, as Arthur locked up the shelter, he felt a tug on his sleeve. He turned to see Joanne standing there, a hesitant look in his eyes. "Can I show you something?" Joanne asked. Arthur nodded, following the boy as he led him through the quiet city streets. After a few blocks, Joanne stopped in front of an old rundown park. The swings were rusted, the benches worn, but there was something nostalgic about the place. "This is where my mom used to bring me when I was little," Joanne said, kicking at the dirt. "When we had nowhere else to go, we came here." Arthur's heart clenched. He could picture it too vividly. Clara, exhausted but determined, watching over their son as he played, despite having nothing. "I should have been here," Arthur murmured. Joanne didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed at one of the swings. "She used to push me on that one." Arthur glanced at the swing, then at Joanne. "Want me to push you now?" The boy snorted. "I'm not a kid anymore." Arthur chuckled. "Fair enough." They stood in silence for a moment before Joanne turned to face him. "I don't know if I can call you Dad yet," he admitted, "but maybe one day." Arthur felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. He nodded, not pushing, not rushing. "That's enough for me." And for the first time in his life, Arthur truly believed that it was. Arthur had to face his past, deal with his mistakes, and prove, through actions, that he was willing to change. But not everyone gets that chance. And you? If you were in Joanne's place, would you give a second chance to someone who abandoned you? Or if you were Arthur, would you have the courage to fight to repair the past? Click on the video on the screen to continue your journey of self-discovery and reflect on your own choices. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge your perception of life. See you in the next video.